Thank you very much indeed for inviting me, Robin, to this august event. And I can say that one of the reasons I'm here is because I've lived in Poland now for 35 years. And one of the reasons I've lived in Poland for 35 years is actually because of you, because you were so supportive of me when Mark Worthington offered me the privilege of representing the Margaret Thatcher Foundation in Poland, and I did so for 3 or 4 years, I remember, with great fondness. But had it not been for that experience, I may have well been back in England now. But thanks to having stayed in Poland for that remarkable period of the early 1990s, set me on my course ever since. And so I must be grateful for you, not only for inviting me here, but also having afforded me the privilege of living in Poland for such a time. I'm very conscious that the evening is moving on, so I'll try to be brief. But I think it's, the topic that you suggested I speak on, which is that of Margaret Thatcher and Central Europe, I think is very, very important, because her influence, of course, was global. It was national in the United Kingdom. But she had a very important impact on the course of European history in that crucial period of the 1980s, which, as we all remember, was a period in which history shifted dramatically. The world order that everyone had considered to be set in stone, or set in ice, more precisely, for 40 years after the end of the Second World War, suddenly moved. And she was at the epicenter of that movement. And her role, I think, has to be recognized as being part of that great historical movement. And particularly from the eyes of the Central Europeans, this was very, very clearly recognized. It was recognized at a time, because I think Central Europeans, after the coming of communism, after the Second World War, never really accepted that history had ended, that the arrival of communism meant that they were forever to be, that the peoples of Central Europe were ever to be enslaved. And there were 3 great revolutions, or attempted revolutions, as we know, before the final collapse of communism in 1989. There was the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. There was the Czechoslovak Revolution, if you like, of 1968, and there was the Solidarity Revolution of 1980. And each of these revolutions represented a different aspect of anti-communist sentiment in Central Europe. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956, I think, encapsulated the desire for independence, for restoration of sovereignty. And the Hungarian revolutionaries of 1956 were very much fighting for Hungary as an independent country, independent from the yoke of Soviet communism. 1968 was slightly different. It was obviously also an anti-Soviet movement in Czechoslovakia, but it was one around where the theme of freedom and personal freedom, I think, was paramount. And if you look at the revolution of solidarity, all of these revolutions, of course, never came to complete fruition, but they could be called revolutions. In Poland, it was much more a revolution driven by the love of the concept of human dignity, where solidarity was not a trade union movement as such. It was in form, but in content, the solidarity trade union was actually an expression of the Poles' burning desire to be restored human dignity in the face of communism and communist oppression. And the other peculiarity of these revolutionary sentiments in Central Europe is they were highly personalized. And the peoples of Central Europe after the Second World War looked to individuals as symbolizing, in the West, symbolizing what these values that they fought for represented. There was the great love of Ronald Reagan, and John O'Sullivan has written a magnificent book on these 3 titanic figures. Ronald Reagan representing the myth of the United States as this beacon of liberty and freedom. There was the figure of John Paul II in the eyes of Central Europeans, especially Poles, representing this impulse of morality and dignity as being the core impulse for resisting communism. But it was Mrs. Thatcher, I think, who was the third figure, as John's book well recognizes, where she was particularly appreciated in Central Europe, not only as a symbol of a figure symbolizing the love of freedom, of individual freedom, but above all as a political leader. And it was this aspect of Mrs. Thatcher as the respect which she garnered in Central Europe under communism was not only a function of her symbolic position as a figure of representing freedom, but as someone who is above all a pragmatic politician. And she was admired for being someone who was a woman of great political principle, someone who embodied the ideology of freedom, but above all as somebody who showed political leadership. And her political leadership that she showed in Great Britain was very, very appreciated. So this bringing together of principle and pragmatism was something that was, I think, the strength of Mrs. Thatcher's popularity in Poland. Now, of course, there's no questioning that Mrs. Thatcher was an anti-communist. We saw that very much in those remarkable footage which Robin showed at the beginning of our meeting today. Her great emotional attachment to human dignity, to freedom, and to the love of independence and sovereign statehood. All of this she recognized were deeply, these were values that communism was deeply hostile to. And so her anti-communism was driven by her deep recognition that it represented the antithesis of all the values that she held dear. During her premiership, she reflected often on the fate of Central Europe. I mean, most significantly, I think, in her Bruges speech of 1988, which for many of us conservatives, we see it through the lens, we see the Bruges speech through the lens of her Euroscepticism or her warning shot against the bowels of Brussels-led federalism. But from the perspective of Central Europe, the Bruges speech was significant because it was one of the very few speeches of Western politicians at the time where she explicitly recognized and stated publicly that Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest are European cities. She didn't mean so in a geographical sense, but what she said in the Bruges speech in relation to Central Europe was that she recognized that Europe as a whole is something very different from the European Union, that Europe as a whole is a cultural concept, that Europe is a Christian concept, and that the division of Europe is an impermanent one. It was not a permanent division of Europe, and she recognized in the Bruges speech that the future of Europe lay not in a federalized Brussels unitary state, but in a Europe whole and free, but rooted in its Christian and its cultural and its historical heritage. And as soon as she could, she used every opportunity to give support to those in Central Europe who loved freedom. Her first trip to Poland in 1988, I think, was very significant because during that visit, which was very, we remember well, marked by huge acts of symbolism, she made a special effort to visit the church of Father Jerzy Popiełuszko, who was the Polish Catholic priest brutally murdered by the communist secret police in 1984, and whose grave was at that time a shrine to Polish emotional resistance to communism and a monument, actually, to the crimes of communism, of which the death of Father Popiełuszko was a symbol. And her visit to the church reflected not just her respect for the Polish people, but her deep sense of spirituality. She recognized that the opposition to communism was as much a religious impulse as it was a moral or political impulse. And during that visit to Poland in 1988, of course, she visited Gdańsk, she visited the Gdańsk shipyard, she met with soon-to-be the president of Poland just 2 years later, Lech Wałęsa. So she was not shy of giving public demonstration to her principles. And the other principle that she loved going to markets. Whenever she visited a Central European country, as she did in Hungary in 1984, she went to the local market, and she did so again in Poland in 1988 to demonstrate that essentially the market is a microcosm of the free market economy. But so she was undoubtedly an anti-communist in spirit and in action, but she was also a pragmatic politician. And this is actually something that some people struggle to understand, especially if they look at her reaction to the imposition of martial law in 1981 in Poland, which was the crushing of the Solidarity Revolution. And many people in retrospect seem surprised that she was actually cautious about the decision initially of the American administration to impose quite strict sanctions on the Soviet Union, especially on the building of the gas pipeline, which the secondary sanctions which the United States sought to impose were opposed by Mrs. Thatcher. And some people are surprised, well, why was this? I mean, wasn't she supposed to be anti-Soviet and anti-communist? Why was she resisting sanctions? Because she recognized that decision of the United States was highly damaging to the unity of NATO. She recognized that whatever her personal feelings were, the deep opposition to this within Germany and France would have led to a fracture within the unity of the NATO alliance. She also felt upset that these sanctions were actually being driven through without recognition of the British national interest and of British companies involved in that pipeline project. But nonetheless, she recognized there was a greater battle afoot, the battle against resisting the Soviet Union, and that the important thing was to absolutely preserve NATO unity, to preserve and maintain the credibility of the NATO alliance, because any cracks in that of which sanctions could have provoked would have been something that the Soviet Union would have only exploited. And many of her actions towards the end of the 1980s also reflected her pragmatism. She made, apart from the visit to Poland in 1988, her other interaction with the Polish government after the fall of communism in 1990 was over the Polish attitude towards the reunification of Germany. As we know, Mrs. Thatcher remained very suspicious of a unified Germany, and she was very keen to support the Polish requirement or request that after 1990 there be a formal settlement of the Polish-German border through a legal instrument to which Chancellor Kohl at the time was very sceptical and opposed to. But it was thanks to the pressure of Lady Thatcher that the German government and the German Chancellor agreed to sign the German-Polish border treaty, which came into force only 2 weeks before her forced eviction in 1990. So there was no. So as I say, the point is basically that she was not just an ideologue in her anti-communism, but she was also a pragmatic politician who recognised the limitations of ideology in a very fraught political international environment. I think the interesting question to ponder more deeply is her legacy in Central Europe after 1990. I think we can say there were two waves of the Thatcher legacy. One was right at the beginning of the changes, and there is little doubt that many of the leading reformers of Central Europe after 1990 looked to Lady Thatcher for inspiration. Václav Klaus in the Czech Republic, of course, Czechoslovakia, and then the Czech Republic, is the best example of this. And many of those who were present at John O'Sullivan's conference just a few weeks ago in Budapest would have heard former President Klaus giving a remarkable testimony to her influence on him and his respect for her as an intellectual leader. In Poland, Also, in the 1990s, at the beginning of the 1990s, the father of the Polish economic reform, Leszek Balcerowicz, although not a conservative himself, in terms of being a free market liberal, looked to Lady Thatcher for inspiration as somebody who laid the ground, ideological ground, for the virtues of privatization, free markets, open trade, floating currency, and monetary control as a way of instilling financial and fiscal discipline. And Leszek Balcerowicz also was somebody who admired Lady Thatcher, Mrs. Thatcher, deeply. It's interesting to note as well that during the 1980s, Poland was unique in Central Europe in having a very vibrant anti-communist, active anti-communist underground. And for those of many in this room perhaps would have been involved in some of the underground activities in Central Europe, but Poland was unique in having a well-developed samizdat publication underground network. And the publication von Hayek, Mises, Friedman, these were all writers who were translated and published in the samizdat. And there was a very significant intellectual community in Poland that then took power in 1990. The current Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, and also the former Prime Minister, Jan Krzysztof Bielecki, were part of this underground network in the 1980s, who were very strongly pro-free markets. But unfortunately, I think in Poland, as in other countries of Central Europe after 1990, the figures, the titanic figures who drove forward political change, the Balceroviches, the Václav Klauses, Václav Havel, and in the case of Hungary, József Antal, for whom Mrs. Thatcher had great respect. She was the only one of the most significant Western politicians who went privately to his funeral in 1994, because she did have a very great respect for the role that József Antal had played in guiding Hungary through the changes of the early 90s. But these figures, Antal, Klaus, Balcerowicz, Havel, were titans of their political time, succeeded really by an increasing pragmatization of politics. And in Poland in particular, this pragmatization of politics resulted in the return of the communists to power in the mid-1990s, and the loss of belief in the principles that Mrs. Thatcher represented, especially on free markets. And one of the great sadnesses of Polish politics today is whichever party you look to, whether it's on the right or the left, they're all dominated by a sort of a soggy center of social democratic policies on economics. So I think we have to be frank to say that the legacy of Lady Thatcher in practical politics today in Central Europe is less than we would have hoped for. But when I was preparing for this meeting, I started to reflect on what the great drama that is unfolding in the east of Europe today, in the Ukraine and Russia. And Robin, I was absolutely struck by the first clip that you showed, that word for word, had you substituted the Ukraine for Croatia and Russia for Serbia, the comments of Lady Thatcher would have matched absolutely what is going on between Ukraine and Russia today. The principles of Lady Thatcher were involving the right of self-determination, the negation of appeasement, the ability to have one's self-determination, the right to arm yourself against an aggressive neighbor, and the right to call for military support in defense of liberty and freedom is something that absolutely today we can replicate when we speak of the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. It's in no doubt in my mind, and those of us or of you who knew Mrs. Thatcher much more than I did would have no doubt where she would have stood today. She did say of Gorbachev that he was a man that she could do business with. I think she would have been under no illusion that Putin is no Gorbachev. that he is an aggressive imperialist dictator that has to be resisted and ultimately defeated in the name of the values that she represented, which were the values of freedom and democracy, and above all, human dignity on the basis of Christian values. And today, I think we have to ask ourselves one question today, and we should ask ourselves, ask yourself where you stand today on Ukraine, and then you will have the answer of whether you are or are not a Thatcherite. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. John, Keith, Marek, bravo. There is no time, I'm afraid, for discussion now. It's now time for coffee.